Hi, this is Russell Colts, and this is the fourth in a series of brief videos to support the Facebook learning group for the book CFT Made Simple, to learn about compassion-focused therapy. Today there were some responses to a thread for a quote that I posted from CFT Made Simple, and I started to write a response, and then I thought, this seems like it would make for a good topic of a short video. So what I thought I would do is just read the quote again to you, read a couple of the responses, and then provide a reply. I should note also that in responding to questions when I do this on the video, I'm not going to come up with a script that I'm going to just give you a nice scripted answer. So what you're going to be getting is what you would get from me if you asked me a question, a live question in a workshop or something like this. You're going to get my best answer just kind of in the moment. So the quote that was on that I'd posted earlier had to do with the kind of not your fault piece in compassion-focused therapy, which we'll be talking about in a good deal more detail when we get into the specific chapters. We're still kind of working through the broad overview that's given in chapter 1. And the quote was, "This not your fault piece doesn't mean that we're letting anyone off the hook or absolving people of their responsibility for their own behavior. It's about being honest with ourselves about which factors we control in our lives and which ones we don't. In fact, it's precisely because of all these factors that we can't control that we need to understand our minds and learn to work with the things we can affect. Our clients may not have chosen to have brains that were shaped by learning experiences to produce crippling fear and anxiety when faced with certain situations, but we can help them cultivate the ability to work effectively with these situations and affects and to validate and support themselves in doing so." So to start out, the whole idea of a not your fault piece really refers to that second layer that I talk about in CFT Made Simple, in this sort of structure I've created in terms of layered processes and practices. And that's the compassionate realizations or the compassionate understandings that we're trying to help people come to about what it means to have a human life. And a big part of that is this recognition that a whole lot of what shapes our life and even our feelings and reactions and responses and behavior and things like this is due to factors that we don't get to choose, to design, and in many cases to control. And we get into this in CFT Made Simple quite a lot. So that ranges from factors like the way we were shaped by evolution, the way our brains were shaped by evolution, the way our emotions tend to play out in terms of how they, the various experiences that are associated with feelings like anger or anxiety or feelings of safeness. And that has to do with things like the way our attention can be shaped. For example, threat emotions tend to narrow and focus the attention onto the perceived source of threat, whereas when we feel safe, our ability to be reflective and pro-social and to have much broader, more flexible attention and thinking and reasoning and things like this widens. So that's just an example of how different emotions can help shape our minds, right? Shape our attention. The correlates, the attentional and memory and thinking correlates of the different emotions that we might feel. And this idea that we don't get to choose whether or not we experience anxiety or whether or not we experience sadness or anger. These are emotions that sort of show up in us. So when we say the not your fault piece of CFT, what I'm really talking about is the recognition of the various aspects of the human experience that we all face that aren't chosen or designed by us. And yet many of us and many of our clients will spend a lot of time condemning ourselves or judging or blaming ourselves for these sorts of responses. Another example of this has to do with social shaping. From the moment of birth, really, we're shaped by social and environmental forces. And the behavioral models are rife with explanations of kind of mechanisms of how this happens. From respondent or classical conditioning, operant conditioning, our behavior is shaped in ways that we don't often get to choose or design, and yet we're reacting to these different environmental influences. And when we're faced with these different contexts, these different environmental influences over time, this can shape not only specific behaviors, but also constellations of behavior that in some ways we can talk about in terms of how our personality is shaped. These kind of ways we tend to respond in different contexts. And again, a lot of that is not chosen or designed by us. So this is just another kind of getting into the various aspects of the not your fault piece of CFT. What we really mean when we talk about not your fault in CFT or not my fault in CFT is to try and refrain from blaming or shaming ourselves for things that we didn't choose or things that we didn't design. So the quote really was around how that works with doing that work with our clients. And I want to read a couple of the responses we got on the thread because I think they get at some common concerns about this aspect of CFT. That's really important. I was really happy to see that even this early in the process, people really get into the nuance of how this actually looks when you do it. So Morton writes, I guess our clients may not have chosen to have brains that were shaped by learning experiences is the evolutionary part of CFT. Well, certainly in the evolutionary aspects of CFT, we talk about kind of the brain and how it shapes our experience. But actually that particular quote, although I used the word brain, was getting at the social shaping. We're shaped by social factors that then kind of shapes how we'll respond to similar stimuli in the future. Right? So we can, for example, become conditioned to experience anxiety in response to certain stimuli. For example, certain things that happen in our lives. Morton then writes, I've gradually turned away from using the "it's not your fault" line to just state, and this is not how you would like to behave or act, as invalidating the negative feelings their actions bring them, and start exploring how they would like to have behaved or would like to behave in the future. I get the impression it creates less of a resistance. They bring up what they have done because they feel bad about it, and I don't want to ignore it by saying it's not their fault. The second piece is that Karen writes is, yes, people have trouble offering themselves compassion in the first place. Might bridle a bit if they're told it's not your fault. But I think we can safely say things like, we didn't choose to have brains that react in this way. Both Morton and Karen are getting at something that's really important, which is that people can have tremendous actual resistance to this message that something is not their fault, that something they experience, they feel, or even that they do is not their fault. I think part of this is cultural. I'm aware that I live in the United States. In the United States, we're very invested in blame. We're very good at blaming. When something goes wrong, we want to know whose fault is it, because it's got to be somebody's fault, right? And so I've experienced probably as much negative reaction to that aspect of CFT probably as with the entire rest of it combined, which is, I don't get very many negative reactions to CFT, but oftentimes when I do, from people who are just learning about it, when they hear anything that smacks of not your fault, they tend to bristle to that, because it can easily be interpreted as we're relieving people of their responsibility for their behavior, which I hope that the quote I read initially kind of disabuses folks of that idea. It's not about saying what you do isn't your fault or isn't your responsibility. It's about trying to actually move people from a place of being ashamed about stuff that they can't control and that they didn't design, to actually taking responsibility for and working with the aspects of their experience and their behavior that they can have some influence or choice over. So there's that. But it sounded like a number of the responses to the thread were around, what did your client do when you say it's not your fault? Well, I just want to say straight away, I almost never say it's not your fault. And if I do, it's in the context of an ongoing, warm therapeutic relationship where I've got an established connection with the person. And there may be maybe a few times in my life I've leaned in and I've said something like, well, you know that's not your fault, right? Right? And kind of humorously, the last time I did that, my client looked at me and said, are you trying to Good Will Hunting me? Because referring to there's a famous scene in Good Will Hunting where Robin Williams says it's not your fault to his client over and over. I think I responded with something like, well, you're damn right I am. And that created kind of a fun moment in the therapy. But more generally, I find that in terms of telling people it's not your fault, I find more generally it's not very useful for me to tell my clients anything, particularly anything that's about their own experience, right? So sometimes there's some explanation in CFT when we talk about the 3 circles or when we talk about these different pieces that you'll learn about. Sometimes there's a little bit of a didactic explanation. But when Paul Gilbert developed compassion-focused therapy, he really developed it as a process of guided discovery. So there's not a lot of telling. You're not lecturing your clients. You're not telling them it's not your fault, right? I'm not the one who gets to decide that about you, about, things like that. So the idea is you're creating a process of guided discovery where you're helping people explore sort of a more subtle understanding, or a more, not subtle, maybe you're saying nuanced understanding of how things came to be this way. Right? How did I get to be at this point in my life responding like this, behaving like this, feeling like this, and what are the causes and conditions, the contextual variables, both internal and external, that contributed to this? And so a lot of that will take the form of Socratic dialogue and Socratic exploration. So just a few questions that might come up as I'm doing this sort of exploration with clients, as we're kind of going through this together. What's your experience? Did you choose to feel like that in that situation? When this situation came up and those feelings came up, how did that happen? Right? Did you choose to respond in that way, or did those feelings arise within you? Another question that I might ask is something like, given what we know about you and your background, does it make sense that you might react this way in this situation? Given what you learned growing up, might we predict that you might feel this way when this happens, or that you might react in this way, right? Does it make sense? Is it surprising that you might get hijacked by these powerful emotions in this situation? For example, if a person hasn't had the learning experiences to know how to handle a situation well, you can even go back into the social shaping and the learning history. How or when did you learn to respond in this way? Can we look at a point in your history where you figured out that, when this happens, you're supposed to get really angry, right? So what we're trying to do, and actually, by the way, that question, how did you learn this, or when did you learn this? Or it sounds like you learned at some point that when this happens, this is how you respond. What that does is it helps create a shift in their understanding of their experience or their behavior from, this is something that's bad about me, to, this is how I learned to respond. And that's a fundamental difference. One is something that's inherently bad about me, and the other is something that's learned. And if I learned this, then I can learn something else. So when I talk about the not your fault part of CFT, that's really what I'm talking about. That process, people discovering the parts of their experience that they chose, of their life that they designed, that they, played a role or they could control shaping, and distinguishing between that and the aspects of their experience in their life that they didn't choose, and they didn't get to shape, and they didn't get to design. And, this, by the way, is not just a cognitive shift. It's not just a shift in thinking, this is my fault, and replacing that thought with, oh, this was not my fault. That's not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm talking about is helping people have a more nuanced experience of how things got to be the way they are in their lives, and having these realizations or these understandings that, oh my goodness, this is why I feel like this in that situation. This helps explain why I tend to react this way in that situation. And I suspect if you're watching this video, you can probably identify situations in which you reacted in ways that don't fit at all with the kind of person you want to be, and yet you behaved that way, you felt in a particular way, and you went with that emotion, and you behaved in a way that doesn't at all fit with the kind of person you want to be. And when you reflect back on it, you might not even be able to think, okay, I chose this, or maybe I did choose it, but that occurs within a context too. That's a deeper discussion. So what I'm talking about is not just a cognitive shift, but this development of an understanding. And when that happens, there's often a very powerful sort of co-occurring affective experience. So an example that I've seen several times in my clients are clients who struggle with intimacy, and instead of feeling safe and comfortable when they get in that close relationship they want to be in, at the kind of new brain thinking level, they want to be in a relationship, they want to be close to other people, they want to be able to give and receive affection, and then when they put themselves in those situations, instead of feeling safe and comfortable, they freak out and they feel terrified and they panic. And this can be really troubling for people. And so when you do that and you start asking these questions, well, when did you learn, or how did you learn that getting close to people was dangerous, or was threatening rather than safe, right? And then explore that attachment history, and people begin to understand how they were shaped by their early social environment. A lot of times, you know, there's some deep sadness that comes up as they become aware of that, and they realize that the fact that they feel this way in these situations is not their fault. There can be a deep sadness, but there also can be a tremendous relief that comes with the understanding, this idea that, oh my gosh, this is why relationships have always been so hard for me. And then in reflecting back on the version of them that struggled again and again and again in this situation, instead of responding with judgment or with this idea that there's something bad about me or wrong with me, that I can't succeed in relationships, they can come up with understanding and compassion for this version of them that only wanted to be close to others, and yet because of their learning history has a terrible time feeling safe. And so that's the kind of thing, the kind of process I'm talking about when I say that not your fault piece. It's not something we say to clients, it's not your fault. It's about working with them to explore these different aspects of their experience to help them identify, what do I choose, what can I control, and what did I not choose, and what can I not control, and if I didn't choose it and I didn't design it, I didn't control it, should I attack myself for it? Does it make sense to beat myself up for it, or would I be better served taking responsibility for the aspects of my experience that I can influence, and cultivating compassionate ways of being in the world, both in relating to myself, my experience, and to others, that could work better for me going forward. So this ran a little longer than I thought it would, but I hope you find it to be useful. Take care, and I'll see you next time.